I never thought a grown man could say something that would make me feel like a kid getting scolded for asking too many questions. But that's exactly what happened when my boss leaned back in his leather chair and said, "Isn't $4,000 a month enough for you?" Just like that. Matter of fact. Like he was commenting on the weather. My name's Nicholas Palmer, I'm 48, and I'd been working in finance long enough to know when numbers don't add up. 20-plus years of looking at spreadsheets, balancing books, and making sure companies don't spend money they don't have. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. Or at least I thought it was. See, $4,000 a month wasn't just my salary. It was what Jonathan Walsh, my boss, thought was enough to buy my silence. He was wrong about that. I worked for a mid-sized maintenance supply company called Industrial Solutions, Inc. You know the type. Industrial cleaners, safety equipment, mops, gloves, the kind of stuff that keeps offices running but nobody really thinks about. We sold to hospitals, schools, office buildings, basic supplies for basic needs. I handled the financial side of things, purchase orders, vendor payments, expense reports, monthly reconciliations. The boring stuff that keeps the lights on and the doors open. Jonathan had been my supervisor for about 3 years. He was one of those guys who always seemed to be in control, always had an answer for everything. Confident in that way that makes you feel like questioning anything was a personal insult to his intelligence. He'd hover behind me when I was working on month-end reports, clicking his pen like a metronome. Always asking the same questions 3 different ways. Like he was hoping one version would catch me in a lie. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. But when you're 48 with a mortgage, 2 kids thinking about college, and a retirement account that's already behind schedule, you learn to work around difficult personalities. It's just part of the job. The weird stuff started small, like it always does. An invoice here and there that didn't quite match up with what we'd actually received. A vendor payment for equipment that never showed up in our warehouse. A business dinner expense on a day when Jonathan didn't have any meetings scheduled according to his calendar. Nothing dramatic enough to set off alarms. Just little inconsistencies that made me scratch my head and wonder if I was missing something obvious. At first, I figured it was the usual business chaos. Systems glitch, vendors mess up paperwork, people forget to update their calendars. Happens all the time in any company. You learn to roll with it. But when you've been doing this job as long as I have, you develop a 6th sense for when something's genuinely off. Like when your car starts making a noise that wasn't there yesterday. You might not know exactly what's wrong, but you know something is. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was going through quarterly reports trying to close out the books when I found a $2,000 payment marked as warehouse equipment upgrades. The problem was, our warehouse hadn't seen any upgrades since the Clinton administration. The place still had the same rusty shelving and flickering fluorescent lights it had when I started working there. I pulled up the vendor information to see what we'd supposedly purchased. The address turned out to be a P.O. box in the next town over. The phone number went straight to a generic voicemail recording that sounded like it had been set up that morning. The business name was Walsh Strategic Solutions, which I found interesting, considering my boss's last name was Walsh. But here's what really got my attention. Walsh Strategic Solutions was registered as an LLC, and a quick search showed Jonathan Walsh as the sole owner and operator. My boss had written himself a $2,000 check from company funds, marked it as equipment upgrades, and signed off on it himself. That's when something cold settled in my stomach. I'd been in this business for over 20 years, and I'd never seen anything quite this blatant. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This wasn't padding an expense account or taking a few extra dollars for lunch. This was systematic theft, and it was hiding in plain sight. I sat there staring at my computer screen for a good 10 minutes, just processing what I was looking at. The worst part wasn't even the theft itself. The worst part was that my signature was on every monthly report that said "reviewed by Nicholas Palmer" at the bottom. If this thing ever came to light, I wasn't going to be treated as a witness who helped uncover fraud. I was going to be treated as the accountant who either participated in it or was too incompetent to notice it. Neither of those options was acceptable to me. Right then, I made a decision. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen this. I wasn't going to file it away and hope it went away on its own. And I definitely wasn't going to let Jonathan Walsh destroy my reputation and my career just because he thought $4,000 a month bought him the right to steal from the company and use my name as cover. but I also wasn't going to rush into anything stupid. At 48, with responsibilities and bills and people counting on me, you don't take risks with your career lightly. If I was going to do something about this, I was going to do it right. I was going to do it smart. And I was going to make sure that when the dust settled, I was still standing. So I started digging. I started coming in 30 minutes earlier and staying an hour later than usual, not because I was trying to be employee of the month, but because I needed time alone with the financial system when Jonathan wasn't around to ask what I was working on. I told myself I was just being thorough with the quarterly reports, but really, I was conducting my own private investigation. What I found over the next few weeks made my stomach turn. The $2,000 Walsh Strategic Solutions payment wasn't a one-time thing. It was part of a pattern that went back almost 3 years, right around the time Jonathan became my supervisor. There were consulting fees, equipment purchases, vendor payments, all following the same basic blueprint. Fake business names, P.O. box addresses, phone numbers that either didn't work or went to generic voicemail systems. The man was systematic about it, I'll give him that. He never took huge amounts that would trigger automatic audits or raise immediate red flags. Usually between $1,500 and $3,000 per transaction, spread out over time, buried in legitimate business expenses. Sometimes he'd go 2 months without a fraudulent payment, then hit 3 transactions in quick succession. It was actually pretty clever, in a criminal sort of way. I started keeping detailed notes, dates, amounts, fake vendor names, the justifications Jonathan had written on the approval forms, operational consulting, warehouse efficiency upgrades, strategic planning services, all meaningless corporate buzzwords that sounded official enough to pass casual review but vague enough that nobody would ask for specifics. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. There were reimbursements for client dinners on days when we hadn't met with any clients, hotel stays in cities where we didn't have suppliers or customers, even a staff bonus distribution that somehow never hit anyone's paycheck except, I assumed, Jonathan's personal account. By my calculations, he'd stolen close to $90,000 over 3 years, and every monthly financial report had my signature at the bottom, certifying that I'd reviewed the numbers and found them accurate. Meanwhile, Jonathan kept acting like he owned the place. He'd walk through the office with this casual confidence, like a man who knew all the angles and had everything under control. He'd tap my computer monitor with his knuckle when reports took too long to load. He'd sigh dramatically when I asked for clarification on expenses, like I was being deliberately difficult. Once he even made a joke about me bringing lunch from home instead of eating out every day. "Careful, Nick," he said, loud enough for the whole office to hear. "People might think I'm not paying you enough." Everyone chuckled. I smiled and nodded because that's what you do when someone who controls your paycheck decides to take a shot at your dignity. But inside, I was keeping score. The thing about being 48 and having done this job for over 20 years is that you develop patience. You learn to think strategically instead of reacting emotionally. I couldn't just march into HR and start throwing around accusations without solid proof. I needed documentation that would hold up under scrutiny. I needed to be absolutely certain of my facts because once I pulled this trigger, there'd be no going back. So I documented everything. I created backup files on my personal laptop at home. I printed copies of key transactions and stored them in a folder behind my tax returns, mixed in with appliance warranties and other boring paperwork that nobody would ever think to steal. I even made an appointment with a financial crimes attorney for a consultation, just to understand what I might be dealing with legally. The attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morse, listened to my story for about 15 minutes, then asked to see some of the documentation I'd brought. She spent another 20 minutes going through the papers, making notes, asking pointed questions about approval processes and oversight procedures. Finally, she looked up and said, "You're in a difficult position. On one hand, you've uncovered what appears to be systematic embezzlement. On the other hand, your signature is on reports that documented these transactions as legitimate business expenses. If this goes public, you need to be prepared to demonstrate that you acted appropriately when you discovered the irregularities." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with Jonathan's theft. I was dealing with the very real possibility that I could be viewed as either incompetent or complicit. The legal consultation cost me $300, but it was the best money I ever spent because it clarified exactly what I needed to do next. I needed to create a clear record of my concerns and Jonathan's responses. I needed to document that I'd identified problems and tried to address them through proper channels before taking any dramatic action. And I needed to make sure that when this eventually exploded, and it would eventually explode, I could prove I'd acted professionally and ethically throughout the entire process. So I started asking Jonathan direct questions about specific transactions, and I started documenting his answers, not confrontationally, just professionally. Hey Jonathan, I'm having trouble finding supporting documentation for this Walsh Strategic Solutions payment. Can you help me track down the contract or work order? Then I'd send a follow-up email summarizing our conversation, copying myself on every exchange. His responses were always variations of the same theme. It's handled. Don't worry about it. Just process the payment. You're overthinking it. Sometimes he'd get irritated and remind me that he was the one who approved expenses, not me. My job was to record them accurately, not question his business decisions. Perfect. Every dismissive response, every refusal to provide documentation, every suggestion that I was overstepping my authority, it all went into my growing file of evidence that I'd tried to address these concerns through normal channels and been shut down. 3 months later, I had what I needed: a clear pattern of fraudulent transactions, documented attempts to get explanations through proper channels, and a paper trail showing that my concerns had been consistently dismissed or deflected. That's when Jonathan made his biggest mistake. He got cocky. The confrontation happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon in November. I'd stayed late to finish the monthly reports, and Jonathan wandered into my office around 6:30 looking like a man with nothing better to do than find someone to bother. He leaned against my doorframe, arms crossed, watching me work with this amused expression, like he was enjoying some private joke. I could feel him standing there, but I kept typing, finishing up the expense reconciliation. The office was empty except for us. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. It was just me, Jonathan, and 3 years' worth of evidence sitting in my computer files. That's when he said it. "Isn't $4,000 a month enough for you?" I stopped typing and looked up. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, like the question should have been obvious. "You're lucky, you know. Most people your age would kill for this kind of stability. Maybe you should focus on appreciating what you have instead of constantly nitpicking every expense report that crosses your desk." My reports, his theft, my problem. I kept my voice level. I'm not nitpicking. I'm doing my job. There are transactions on the books that don't have proper supporting documentation. Jonathan pushed off from the doorframe and walked into my office. "You're overthinking it, Nick. That's always been your problem. You get so buried in details that you miss the bigger picture." "What bigger picture is that?" "The picture where I'm responsible for this department. I approve the expenses, and your job is to process them accurately. That's it. That's the extent of your responsibilities here." There was a time when that kind of response might have worked on me, when I might have second-guessed myself, assumed I was missing something obvious, backed down to keep the peace. But I'd spent 3 months documenting every questionable transaction, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. "Then help me understand this one," I said, turning my monitor so he could see the screen. I'd pulled up the latest Walsh Strategic Solutions payment, a $20,500 charge for operational consulting services that had been processed the week before. We never received any consulting services. The vendor address is a P.O. box. The phone number goes to voicemail. And the business is registered under your name. For just a second, maybe half a second, his confident mask slipped. His eyes flickered like he'd walked into a room and forgotten why he'd come in. Then the composure snapped back into place. "Do you think you know more about running this business than I do?" "That's not what I said. You're questioning my judgment. You're implying that I don't know what's best for this company." His voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more threatening than if he'd started yelling. "I'm asking for documentation that supports the payment. That's standard procedure for any—" "Standard procedure," he interrupted, "is that I approve expenditures and you record them. If you can't handle that basic arrangement, maybe we need to reconsider whether $4,000 a month is appropriate compensation for the value you're bringing to this position." There it was, the threat, the implication that my paycheck came with strings attached, that questioning his decisions was grounds for termination. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Silence made Jonathan more uncomfortable than arguing ever did. "I'll document my concerns in writing," I said finally. If there's a legitimate explanation for these payments, having it in writing protects both of us. His jaw tightened. You don't need to document anything. You need to process payments when I approve them and stop creating problems where none exist. I am processing the payments. I'm also noting discrepancies. That's part of maintaining accurate financial records. Something shifted in his expression then. Not anger exactly, but calculation. Like he was trying to figure out how much I actually knew and what I might do with that knowledge. You know what your problem is, Nick? You don't understand loyalty. This company has been good to you. I've been good to you. And instead of showing some appreciation, you spend your time looking for reasons to cause trouble. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice calm and professional. I appreciate my job, but my signature is on reports that say I've reviewed these transactions and found them accurate. If there are problems, I need to document them. There are no problems, he said firmly. There are expenses that I've approved for legitimate business purposes. If you can't trust my judgment on that, maybe this isn't the right position for you. That was his second threat in 5 minutes. I made a mental note to include both in the email summary I'd send myself when he left. I understand, I said. I'll make sure everything is properly documented. He stared at me for another few seconds, probably trying to figure out whether I was backing down or standing my ground. Then he shook his head and walked out, muttering something about ungrateful employees under his breath. I sat back down and immediately opened my email to document the entire conversation while it was fresh in my memory. Date, time, direct quotes, witnesses present, none, and a summary of Jonathan's refusal to provide supporting documentation for questionable transactions. But the interesting thing was, I wasn't shaking. I wasn't scared. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Jonathan had just shown me exactly who he was and what he was willing to do to protect his theft. More importantly, he'd made it clear that he viewed my $4,000 monthly salary as leverage to keep me quiet. 3 weeks later, everything started to unravel. Not because of anything I did directly, but because external forces began asking the same questions I'd been raising internally. Our quarterly audit was coming up, and the external accounting firm sent over their senior reviewer to do preliminary fieldwork. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was exactly the kind of person Jonathan couldn't charm or intimidate. Mid-40s, professional, methodical, with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that comes from 20 years of looking at other people's books and knowing when something doesn't add up. I watched her face as she went through the financial reports I'd prepared. Her eyes lingered on certain pages just a little too long. She made notes that seemed more detailed than usual. And when she got to the vendor payment summaries, she spent a full 10 minutes just staring at the screen. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "Can you print detailed backup documentation for these consulting payments? I'd like to review the contracts and work product deliverables." Jonathan answered before I could say anything. "They're all legitimate business expenses. I can provide additional details if needed, but the payments were properly approved through normal channels." Sarah didn't argue. She just made another note on her pad and said, "I'll need the supporting documentation before I can complete the review." After she left that day, I knew it was only a matter of time. 2 days later, Sarah called me directly. Not Jonathan, not the main office line, but my desk extension. She said she needed to schedule a separate conversation to clarify some accounting entries, strictly procedural, and could we meet the next morning before normal business hours. Strictly procedural. Right. We met at 7:30 a.m., an hour before Jonathan usually arrived. Sarah opened with routine questions about vendor codes and invoice processing, but I could tell she was building towards something specific. Then her tone shifted. "Nick, there are multiple consulting payments from Walsh Strategic Solutions over the past 2 years, all approved by Jonathan. Do you have any supporting documentation showing what services were provided?" "No supporting documentation was provided," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "And you requested it?" "Multiple times. The requests were dismissed." She paused, and I heard her typing notes. "I need you to send me all the detailed records you have access to, complete transaction histories, email exchanges, anything that shows the pattern of these payments. Is this part of the standard audit?" "Not exactly, but it needs to be done properly, and I'd rather work with someone who understands the importance of accurate documentation." That afternoon, I sent Sarah everything. Every flagged transaction, every email where Jonathan had dismissed my concerns, every pattern I'd identified over 3 months of careful investigation. I also included my documentation of our recent confrontation, including his threats about my salary and job security. By Thursday morning, the company owners were asking questions. Jennifer Brooks and Kevin Murphy, who normally lived in Phoenix and only dealt with the business remotely, suddenly wanted detailed explanations for multiple expense categories. They scheduled an emergency video conference for that afternoon. Jonathan spent the morning pacing around the office like a trapped animal. He kept checking his email, taking phone calls in his office with the door closed, and looking generally like a man who knew something bad was coming but wasn't sure what or when. The meeting started at 2:00 p.m. Jonathan tried to run it like a normal quarterly review, going through sales numbers and inventory reports with his usual confident presentation style. But Jennifer cut him off about 10 minutes in. "Jonathan, we need to discuss some expense irregularities that were flagged during the audit prep. Specifically consulting payments to Walsh Strategic Solutions." I watched his face change in real time. The confident mask slipped, and for just a moment, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd been caught stealing. "Which payments are you referring to?" he asked, stalling for time. "All of them," Kevin said from the video screen. "We're showing multiple payments over 24 months, totaling close to $47,000, with no supporting contracts, deliverables, or documentation of services rendered." Jonathan tried to recover. "Those are legitimate consulting expenses for operational improvements and strategic planning. I can provide additional details if needed." "We need those details now," Jennifer said, "because from where we're sitting, this looks like company funds being paid to a business entity that you personally own and control." The room went completely quiet. Jonathan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried to smile like this was all a big misunderstanding. "I think there's some confusion here about normal business practices," and "There's no confusion," Kevin interrupted. "We've reviewed all the documentation. Nick, can you walk us through what you found when you tried to verify these payments?" For the next 20 minutes, I laid out everything. The fake vendor addresses, the non-working phone numbers, the complete lack of any services actually provided, and most importantly, the pattern of dismissal and threats when I'd tried to get proper documentation through normal channels. Jonathan tried to interrupt several times, tried to shift blame, tried to suggest I was overstepping my authority or misunderstanding normal business procedures. But the numbers didn't lie, and I had documentation for everything. When I finished, Jennifer looked directly at Jonathan. "Do you have anything to add that would change our understanding of this situation?" Jonathan stared at the table for a long moment. When he looked up, the fight had gone out of him. "I made some poor decisions. I was going to make it right." "By continuing to approve payments to yourself?" He didn't answer. 20 minutes later, Jonathan was cleaning out his office. HR was there to make sure he returned all company property and to escort him out of the building. The whole thing was handled quietly, professionally, like a routine personnel change rather than the end result of a fraud investigation. Before he left, he stopped at my desk. "You know this isn't over, right? They'll find ways to blame you for not catching it sooner." I looked up at him. "Maybe, but I documented everything I found and everything I did about it. That's all I can control." He shook his head and walked away. 3 months later, the formal investigation was complete. Forensic accountants found evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling $127,000 over 4 years. The company recovered most of it through Jonathan's settlement agreement, which included his agreement not to work in any financial capacity for 5 years. They offered me Jonathan's position, a significant raise, and recognition for my role in uncovering the fraud. I thought about it for exactly 1 week. "I appreciate the offer," I told Jennifer, "but I think it's time for me to move on." Can I ask why? Because for 3 months I raised legitimate concerns about financial irregularities, and the only reason anyone listened was because an external auditor asked the same questions. I don't want to work somewhere I have to prove I'm telling the truth about numbers that are right there on the page. She nodded. "I understand. You'll have our strongest recommendation." These days, I work for a smaller firm where integrity isn't negotiable and questions are welcomed, not punished. The pay is better than $4,000 a month. The environment is everything my old job wasn't. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Jonathan. The honest answer is no. He made his choices, and I made mine. When he asked if $4,000 a month was enough for me, he wasn't really asking about money. He was asking what my conscience cost. Turns out it wasn't for sale.